All right, we are back for our keynote conversation. Ken, can you hear us? Awesome,
Yes, Phoenix, how are you?
really good, thank you. This day is gone in a flash. Honestly, it's been great. How are you?
Good. I loved hearing the panel just now. It was so fun to see so many old friends, and it's just wonderful to be part of this conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to take part. So I know I've sent you some preamble questions, but I'll just go ahead and introduce you for our audience, and then we can jump right in if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
Awesome. So, everyone in the chat, everyone who's viewing, please join me in welcoming Ken Liu. Ken Liu is an American author of speculative fiction, winner of the Nebula Hugo World Fantasy Awards. He wrote the Dandelion Dynasty, a silk punk epic fantasy series, as well as the short story collection, The Paper Menagerie, and other stories. His latest book, which I have right here, is All That We See or Seem, a techno thriller starring an AI whispering hacker who saves the world. And prior to becoming a full time writer, Lou worked as a software engineer, corporate lawyer, and litigation consultant. And Lou frequently speaks on a variety of topics, including futurism, the history of creative technologies, bookmaking, and the mathematics of origami. So, again, thank you so much for joining us today, Ken. Um, if it's okay, we'll aim to chat for about 40 minutes and then we'll go to Q&A from our audience. So yeah, let's just jump right in. So as I mentioned, this is your new novel, All That We See or Seem. Covers very different ground to your Dandelion Dynasty quartet. So I'd love it if you could tell us a bit about the origins of the book, and especially your protagonist, Julia Z, who is the aforementioned AI whispering hacker who saves the world.
Yeah, absolutely. In some ways, right, All That We See or Seem is a very different book from the Dandan Dynasty. But in other ways, it really continues in the same sort of thematic ground. So I'll just briefly talk about what the book is. So Julia Z, the protagonist of this new series, um, she is a little bit like Clarice Starling or the girl with the dragon tattoo, right? One of those young women, young heroine with a very traumatic past. I'll just put it at that. But she has a very strong moral compass, and she does not. She is compelled to seek justice despite the fact that it costs her a great deal to simply just be in the world. And she realizes very soon that in order to confront the darkness out there, she has to confront the darkness within herself. That's basically who she is. It's a The world of All That We See or Seem is basically set 5 minutes in the future. I don't even call it sci-fi because in some ways, every single speculative element is either already actually here or is possible, but simply hasn't been scaled up. So it's
Mhm.
not so much, I'm not so much speculating about impossible things as things that are actually already being done. I simply want to work out the implications of what that means. Um, in terms of, I mean that probably sounds actually very familiar to a lot of people who know my work. My big thing throughout, whether I'm writing fantasy or sci-fi, or historical fiction for that matter, is technology. I was trained as a technologist. My primary interest is technology as a way of human expression. I actually think a great deal of so-called sci-fi really ought to be called tech-fi because they're really about technology. They're not so much about novel scientific principles or the scientific method as they are about what engineers actually do and what technologists actually do and what it means to express our humanity through our technology. Um, and, and the Danzan Dynasty was very much about that. And so is this new series. The Julia Z series explores technology from this perspective. Um, as far as how this book came to me, it's a little unusual in the sense that instead of me going out there to look for a book, Julia Z came to find me, if you will. I first encountered her near the end of the pandemic era. I was working at home, right, trying to meet some short fiction deadlines, and I was actually working on an essay on AI and what it means to be an artist in this age where machines seem to be encroaching on human craft in a way that was unprecedented, and it was very hard to work out what the implications were. And I, wrote about my anxieties and my concerns and my experiments with AI and what I was thinking at the time. Um, and as I was working on the essay, the character of Julia Z just came to me out of the blue. I could see her very vividly. She came to me and she was very surly, very grumpy, just not a very sociable person at all. And she came to me and she said, "You're just wrong. You're very wrong." And I was very shocked, and I said, "Okay, what do you mean?" And she said, "You're here worried about machines replacing humans, when in fact what you should be worried about is humans treating each other as machines. That's really
Mm,
the the
mhm,
the
mhm,
problem."
mhm,
And I was just very intrigued. And so I
mm,
wanted to learn more about her, and that is really how the series came to be. I wanted to understand who she was. Who is this strange
mhm.
woman who came to me and wanted to tell me I was wrong? It clearly, cost her a great deal to come to me and tell me that she wasn't very sociable at all, but she wanted to let me know that I was wrong. That's who she is,
Yeah,
right? Even though
yeah,
it's very difficult for her to do this, she wanted to make sure she got her voice out there. Um, anyway, that's how the book came to me.
that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And as you were speaking, it struck me that of course there's a link with the Dandelion Dynasty, because there's so much technology within that. The Kruben submarines, the airships, the kites. I mean, the weapons of war. Um, yeah, it sort of was really like a revelation actually when you mentioned that. I was like, of course, this is the same DNA. That's fantastic. So, you mentioned in the acknowledgements that all that we see or seem started as a novelette, and then you're encouraged to expand it. Could you speak about that process? So you have this visitation from Julia Z as you're doing your research for your AI article. How does that look like then as it
Yeah.
comes onto the page?
So this is what happened. My publisher, Saga Books, an imprint of Simon Schuster, they were trying to celebrate, I believe, the 10-year anniversary of their establishment, and um, they asked me to basically write one of these very short books, something like a novella or a very short novel,
Mm,
and I started thinking about whether Julia Z, the character who came to me, would be a good hero for something like that. And so I started trying to plot out the very short novel or novella. And
mhm.
as I was plotting it out and trying to work out the outline, I told myself, okay, I'm not sure I can squeeze this into 20,000 words. I'm not sure I can squeeze it into even 25,000 words or 30,000 words or
Mm.
40,000 words. At some point, I said, okay, I'm going to write to my agent and just explain the situation. I said, okay, I'm sorry, but I don't think I can squeeze this into the length that Saga wanted. But I really like this character. I'm interested in trying to see if I can actually turn this into a full-length novel. I hadn't actually written anything yet, just outlines, just pages and pages of handwritten notes. And my agent
Mhm.
was like, okay, well, I'll take care of it. So he went and spoke with Saga. And long story short, the idea was sufficiently intriguing to them that they said, okay, why don't you actually write the novel? Instead of the old deadline for the novella, well, we'll just forget about that. Let's write this into a novel.
Mhm.
So that's how that came to be. I
Mm.
realized that it's not just one novel, it's actually a whole series of books,
Mm.
because I do think Julia Z is a really interesting figure. Um,
Mhm.
she is sort of, I don't know. She feels to me like the right hero for our moment. This is a moment
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
great confusion, of great transformation and possibility, where we're not sure what we really want. It's one of those
Mm.
moments
Interesting.
where there's so much possibility, and there's so much tension. You can feel, the hope, but also the despair.
Hmm.
And Julia is somebody who, again, in order to move forward, she has to confront the darkness within. And I feel that in some ways is a really perfect metaphor for the United States in this moment.
Hmm.
And so, I wanted to use her to sort of explore the whole concept of the American dream as well.
Hmm.
So anyway, I ended up proposing a whole series of novels involving her. And this is where we are. And I'm
Hmm.
just having a great time really writing these novels. They're very different from what I've done before, and yet, as we've noted, they're also very connected
Hmm.
thematically with
Yeah.
what I've always been interested in. And so it's been a great fit.
Yeah. I'm really struck by that. The kind of cultural anxiety about exactly as you put, not sure about what we want. We're sort of stuck between these often quite extreme options in a way. Um, and I'm glad they're having a good time writing it. And I don't mean to embarrass you, but I really do think that this novel is sort of doing for the age of AI what something like Neuromancer did for the age of the internet. Because
Mm,
I love that you're calling it sort of tech-fi, in that it's not science fiction, set in the far future, spaceships and aliens and so on. Although we love that, of course. This is really 5 minutes into the future, like you're saying, and much of what you talk about in the book and the scenarios and problems that Julia Z faces. These are things that ostensibly are happening today. Um, so on that, I'd love to, if you could share a bit more about your plotting process, because as I was reading it, I was constantly having that feeling of how is she going to, like, what is she up to now? Like, but the character always felt one step ahead of me as a reader in the best way possible. So how did you come about? How did you manage that in your writing, if that makes sense?
that was incredibly fun. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I started out as a technologist, and I spent actually
Mm,
a number of years working as a litigation consultant on cases involving hacking and stolen trade secrets and all sorts of related
mm,
issues. So there's a huge wealth of material to draw from,
mm,
and it
mhm,
was very fun for me to sort of um, again, draw on that knowledge, but also look into where hacking has gone to, the sort of
mhm,
attack surfaces that are exposed by this massive sudden deployment of AI
mhm,
and the
mhm,
sort of vibe coded applications out there. There are just many,
mhm,
many new ways for people to attack these technology infrastructures and
mhm,
deployments. And it was a lot of fun for me to sort of put myself in Julia's position and figure out what she would do and what her adversaries would do and how she would
mhm.
try to combat those issues. Um, it's fundamentally, again, my favorite genre of fiction to write, which is competence. Competence tales,
Yeah, yeah,
tales about
yeah,
people being competent, people
yeah.
being clever, people trying to figure out how to solve their problems in ways that
Mhm,
follow the rules of the world, but
mhm,
are unexpected.
mhm,
I think this is something that everybody who is an audience can identify with. We
mhm,
love
mhm.
these genres because we love games, we love rule-based
Right,
systems, we
right.
love
Yeah,
playing with systems. That's what
yeah.
Julia does. Then I wanted
Mhm,
to sort of figure out in this new age of generative AI, what are
mm,
both the terrible things that are being done, as well as what are the possibilities? What are the ways
mm,
for the average citizen to hold up these tools as
mhm,
ways to bring down power? That's
mhm.
always what I'm interested in, right? And I think too much emphasis has been placed on the ways in which corporate entities can hurt us with this sort of stuff. But what
Right,
are the
right,
ways in which we
right.
can push back? What are the ways in
Yeah,
which, when we have data sovereignty, that we can use these technologies to
yeah,
promote freedom, to promote individual fulfillment, to actually strike
yeah.
back at all of those who would
Mhm,
try to reduce us to mere machines? Those
mhm,
are the things
mhm,
I'm interested in.
mhm. Right, and that's really interesting to think about in relation to one of the characters in the novel, Ellie, who's in a near effects.
Mhm.
She, who for those who haven't read the book, it's an near effects is kind of like a DJ, but for dreams. She sort of facilitates these collective gatherings, whereby her AI interfaces with the AIs of the audience and facilitates this collective, but also. Um, very individual, almost intimate connection, right, with
Yes.
each person. So, in light of what you just said about these kind of possibilities for data sovereignty, right, of the individual being actually being able to control in some ways, we're not just capitalist, late capitalist cogs that are manipulated. What are some ways that we can reclaim these kinds of this kind of individuality, especially in online spaces, which can
Mm,
be some kind of
mm,
anonymized
mm,
collectivity.
mm.
um
I mean, I think there's a huge amount of anger and rage at big tech. It's been building up over decades, and if you look at the history of how we got here, it has been a very slow boiling situation where step by step we gave up more and more and more control over
right.
our own data until we are no longer in charge, but we are merely allowed to. Has become their world, and we're merely allowed to play in it. This is it didn't take a this didn't happen overnight. It took decades for us to get here. But
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line is we are in a position where we no longer have control of our own data. I
Mm.
mean, think about how many artists have placed so much of their own creation and their own identity onto platforms like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Blue Sky. None of none of these platforms are actually open spaces. All of them are there
Mm.
to claim your data. You are
Right.
the product for all of these
Right.
platforms. What is truly astonishing is, the language that's used by all these companies are um, really instances of newspeak, right? They talk about
Right.
agentic AI, but the reality is they're all trying to turn you into their agents, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to give you
Mm-hmm.
a very
Mm-hmm.
simple example, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of agentic AI systems are designed to supposedly to make your life easier by allowing you
Mm-hmm.
to by allowing their systems to help you out by completing tasks on your behalf. But because of the way these systems are architected, what's actually happening is that you are serving as the company's agent to give it more
Right.
data. The
Yeah.
reason why these companies are giving you so much capability and compute is so that you
Mm-hmm.
can now open up and get it into databases and data spaces that it has no access to otherwise. In the same manner that those
Interesting. Yeah.
robot vacuums are not really there to
Mm.
make your life easier, they're there
Right.
to map the insides of your houses to be able to sell that data, right?
Oh, that's
Once
creepy.
again, once again,
Yeah.
right? In all these
Yeah.
cases, you're not actually
Mm.
the customer. You're merely the product. That is what's
Mm-hmm.
astonishing about this moment. We are not the
Mm.
consumers. People
Yeah.
keep on
Yeah.
asking, how can these companies
Yeah.
make money when they're giving it for free? Well, that's
Yeah.
because you're the product. We are in the
Yeah.
matrix. It's just that we're not batteries. We're the data suppliers, and we're being
Yeah.
sold. So the solution to that, if you read the book that I
Yeah.
propose, is fundamentally a techno optimistic one, which is the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
fundamental issue here is we should not believe in this mythology that the
Mm-hmm.
future is one about where we give up all of our data to the cloud
Mm-hmm.
in exchange for
Mm-hmm.
convenience. And that I think
Mm-hmm.
that is a very false promise. What we
Mm-hmm.
really need and want and should get back is control over our own compute and our data. It is simply
Mm.
not true that to
Mm-hmm.
produce this sort of useful AI, we require the kind of computational resources out
Mm.
there. No, for
Mm-hmm.
on an individual level, what we what will happen is it will be expensive to train the initial data,
Mm-hmm.
but the
Yeah.
ability to run inferences on these models, that's actually very cheap and can be done in analog hardware very
Mm.
cheaply. We should be able to get to the point where all of us have these very simple bits of hardware that we can carry with
Mm.
us that will
Right.
allow us to run our own personal AI. We will be able to
Mm.
judge and decide what data to feed our own personal AI.
Yeah.
We will be able to
Yeah.
decide what sort of things we wish to automate and which we won't. We will be able to have all
Yeah.
kinds of abilities to actually control our own relationship to this kind
Mm-hmm.
of mechanistic machine learning environment. It should
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
be the case that we give up all agency to
Hmm.
some remote operator who treats us as mere data, but
Hmm.
have control of our own relationship to this kind of algorithmic machine learning
Hmm.
kind
Hmm.
of environment. And I do actually think there's a lot of interesting applications that we can do in that sort of future. If we
Hmm.
are in control of our own compute and our own data and our own AI, we will be
Yeah.
able to basically reflect and examine our own cognitive
Hmm.
processes
Hmm.
in a way that is simply not possible. I mean, I can sort of talk about so much about this. So many of the reasons of why
Yeah.
generative AI is crappy and shitty right now can be
Yeah.
attributed to the fact that we have no control over it and we have no
Hmm.
consent over it, and that we are merely the products, not the
Hmm.
actual
Hmm.
users.
Hmm.
But almost all of these issues will go away. And in fact, the
Mm.
full potential of generative AI cannot be unlocked until and
Mm.
unless we have data sovereignty. And I
Hmm.
do
Hmm.
actually work out many of the positive ways in which generative AI
Hmm.
can actually be interesting to artists and not merely a thief and a threat
Hmm.
and a kind of mindless slop generator. There are actually
Hmm.
ways for
Hmm.
these technologies to be actually useful to us. I mean, heck, this is the first time we're able to realize that intelligence is actually not necessarily tied to consciousness or to agency. I
Hmm.
think that's actually quite shocking to be able
Yeah.
to use machine learning for as a kind of bicycle for the mind, if you will, to
Hmm. Hmm.
maximize and amplify our human capacity. That's what I'm interested in, not this weird. Let's turn everything into a flat kind of corporate controlled AI slop. This is
Yeah.
not the future we signed up for, and nor does it have to be.
No, definitely not. Gosh, says again, so many things that it's making my thoughts go all over the place. But I think you've hit the nail on the head with your reformulation of it as we are the products and not consumers of these kinds of technologies. Because I always wonder, and I'm not the most tech savvy person. I will admit, my colleagues will tell you. But I often wonder, given dead internet theory and it's bots talking to bots or bots trying to sell each other things, an AI doesn't have it doesn't have an income stream. I don't think it can. Maybe it can purchase things. I'm always thinking, what is the end game, right? If we are just sort of generating this endless amount of data that's then sort of sucked up into these sort of systems, at some point you still, and this is where my kind of pessimistic reading comes in. You still need human labor. You still need human capital, right, to somehow sustain these systems, and it's almost like our lives are the kind of currency, right? The experiential moments in our lives, our shopping tastes, our taste in music, our taste in film, you name it, almost like that becomes a kind of currency in its own right that um, feeds into a kind of machine. But you're making me think as well as you're talking. I wonder if we need some kind of technological literacy to be taught in
Mm.
schools, or just as we should have financial literacy taught to young people and people of all ages growing up with this technology, right? It seems to me you're calling for that kind of individual responsibility or sort of pedagogy, right, of how to navigate. And I think, to go back to the book, you see Julia using many kinds of, I guess, non-networked, like, pieces, or very localized pieces of technology, which might be getting us towards what you were saying about that kind of data sovereignty of the individual, right, and how they're interfacing with technology on an individual and then a kind of networked, more collective basis.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I haven't formed a question there. I'm just thinking with you. I think it's
No, no,
alongside everything you're saying.
I want to riff off of what you said here because that's very important.
Mm,
So so Julia has this guideline for how she uses technology, and I think it's actually a pretty good one, which is basically
mm,
this: is this use of technology making you more human or less so? Right.
mm, mhm,
That
mhm,
is the distinction for her. Right. So her critique for me originally was I'm too obsessed with machines replacing humans. I'm not
mhm,
sufficiently concerned about humans treating each other as machines. I, I, I'm not still 100% sure I understand what she meant by that, but here's what I take her to mean. Um,
Mm,
Modernity has had this very long history of trying to reduce humans to machines. And
mhm,
generative
mhm,
AI is just the latest example of it. It's
mhm,
not, a qualitatively different attempt than the general effort by modernity. All modern ideologies, whether it's
mhm,
capitalism or communism or what have you, all of these modern ideologies or modern faith, if you will, have
mhm,
fundamentally the same trend of reducing humans to machines. So what do I mean by that? What is the innovation of the assembly line? The assembly line is innovative because it turns humans into components of a larger machine. The more
mm,
efficient the assembly line is, the less individual discretion each worker has. Each worker is
mhm,
supposed to simply perform a set of tasks in accordance with tailorized taylorism, tailorized
mhm,
efficiency procedures. That is what makes an assembly line efficient. So that's the
mhm,
benefit of that kind of production method. That
mhm,
has
mhm,
been sort of pushed throughout the entire economy. The modern economy is all about
mm.
reducing individual workers to the position of machines. So
Right.
what are call center workers like, right? So if you sort of studied, right, call centers,
Mhm,
more and more individual representatives are given less discretion. All the incentives in the system are geared towards having these reps behave like machines. They're there just to
mm.
follow the manual. They're not allowed to solve
Yeah,
problems. They must follow the manual. Um,
yeah,
they are incentivized and judged by how quickly they can get rid of
mhm,
callers. They are
yeah,
they are they are incentivized to hang up on you, to get rid of you, to delay,
mhm,
to transfer you around. The system is
mhm,
designed
mhm,
to
mhm.
remove empathy. That's actually one of the most important things.
Yes,
One of the
yes,
things
yeah,
they have to train call center workers to do is you
mhm,
cannot feel bad for the customer. You
mhm,
must not feel bad for the customer. You must
mhm,
not behave like a human being. You must behave like a machine.
mhm, mhm.
That's what Julia meant, right? So by the
Yeah,
time that these large corporations are removing the human callers from the call centers, the
yeah,
human workers, and replace them with AI systems, this has long been there, right? In the same way that your
mm,
Amazon
mm,
warehouse
mhm,
worker
mhm,
is there simply
mhm.
because it's still hard for machines to pick up things without breaking them. But the
Mhm.
worker is guided by machines and meant to behave like a machine. I
Yeah,
feel like,
yeah.
when we're talking about preserving jobs, we really have to recognize that it is not worthwhile and it should not be the point of a democratic system to preserve jobs in which humans are treated like
Mm,
machines. This is
right,
not what we should be
right.
doing. This is
Yeah,
not what we should be trying to preserve.
yeah.
So back to what I was trying to point out earlier. So
Mhm.
Julia's entire relationship to tech is this whole idea of, does this particular use of technology promote humanity, or does it make us behave more like machines? So
Mhm.
if you can think about another technology, right, something like the calculator or the graphing calculator, right? There
Mhm.
was some moral panic, right, among math educators and students back when graphing calculators were first introduced. This is actually kind of scary, right? Now our students are just going to learn to push a bunch of buttons, and they will have no
Yeah.
sense of how these graphs work and why, why functions are the way they are. Well, they will have no sense basically of calculus anymore because all they
Mhm.
know how to
Mhm.
do is punch some buttons. But here's the
You're right.
thing. How are you using the calculators? If you're using graphing calculators to do the same things that you used to ask students to do, then of course you're reducing students to machines because you're reducing
Mm,
them to outsource the most interesting part of their thinking, which is to learn the math
mhm.
and understand the intuition behind the math, into pushing a bunch of buttons. That's clearly
Mhm.
a more mechanistic way of using technology. However, if you're telling students, okay, now that you've been freed from the mechanical calculations of plotting a graph. Let's give you
Yeah.
much more complicated graphs. Let's have you
Yes.
explore
Yeah.
two-dimensional
Yeah.
graphs. Let's have you explore
Yeah.
three-dimensional, four-dimensional figures that you cannot
Yeah.
otherwise by hand calculate and draw.
Mm-hmm.
I found
Mm-hmm.
that to be far more interesting. I mean, when I was
Mm-hmm.
allowed to use a graphing calculator, I was finally able to explore the kind of three-dimensional surfaces that I could not have explored
Mm-hmm.
beforehand by doing calculations by hand. And once I had
Mm-hmm.
Mathematica, I could now do four-dimension and multi-dimensional
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
stuff that I couldn't do with a graphing calculator. It truly
Mm-hmm.
was a bicycle for the mind. It
Yeah.
allowed my mind to reach into places it could not have reached before and see things that I could not have seen
Mm-hmm.
before. If you ask me whether I felt more human with Mathematica and graphing calculator or less so, the answer is of course more. I was now
Mm.
able to be more creative and see more things that I couldn't see before.
Mm-hmm.
In the
Mm-hmm.
same
Mm-hmm.
way that a literate person has access to
Mm-hmm.
much more information and knowledge than an
Mm-hmm.
illiterate person. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that text, written language itself is a technology
Mm-hmm.
that enables us to
Yeah.
be more human, the graphing calculator did too. I think we're
Mm-hmm.
in that moment where we don't know how to use AI in a way that actually
Yeah.
does this. So many of our critiques of AI to me are just stuck in this mode of, if you use AI to merely replace human thinking, if you have a
Mm-hmm.
student
Mm-hmm.
simply push a button and stop thinking, then of course it's
Mm-hmm.
no different than telling the student with a graphing calculator to do the exact same thing they used to do, only now with a machine replacing the part that was actually relevant and interesting and useful.
Mm-hmm.
What we need to
Mm-hmm.
do is to go to the next step of saying, now that
Mm-hmm.
you have AI as a research assistant and you know of ways to actually do research that can get beyond the hallucinations of all this nonsense, what are the
Mm-hmm.
things that people can now actually do?
Yeah.
How are people able to be more human with this
Yeah.
machine taking over the stuff that make us
Mm-hmm.
less human, the stuff that weigh us down? That's so much more interesting. That's so much more,
Yeah.
liberating for me to think about.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely fascinating. So I was actually thinking along with you as you were saying that. And so I'd be curious to sort of think through this scenario with you. So what that kind of 4D mathematics looks like, right? So say, taking as a hypothetical, I know there are large language models as they exist now have scraping machines, plagiarism machines, energy usage, so on. Say we have this hypothetical model that say a writer, so just you put all your work, it's just a very localized LLM that is solely be trained on your work with your consent. You can then have a different kind of relationship to it. What kinds of, and this may be too abstract, but what kinds of um, creativity or freedom does that
Oh,
allow?
so many, so
Um,
many. So a very concrete example would be, I would love to have
mm,
an AI that is trained to be very skeptical about my claims and to constantly challenge
mm,
me on things. A
mm,
true devil's advocate, but in a really
mhm,
reasonable, powerful way. So if I were writing an essay, I would love to
mhm,
feed my essay to this AI and tell it to challenge me.
mhm,
Not for the AI to generate anything, but for the AI to ask me questions. The AI would say, okay,
mhm,
you claimed this, but I have
mhm,
found this other thing that is a
mm,
direct contradiction to you. How do you justify that? You
mm,
claim this is a good policy, but what
mm,
about this that you didn't think about? I would want
mhm,
an AI to come to me and constantly challenge me and ask me all kinds of
mhm,
interesting questions to force me to think harder, to force me to be more
mhm,
human. That would be
mhm,
incredibly useful, interesting. Again, notice what I'm saying here. It's not
mm,
you prompting the AI, but having the AI prompting you. That I think is a
mm,
far more interesting use case than the other way around. Alternatively,
mm,
some other ways that might be interesting. So just recently, right, I was studying the history of manuscripts, and so I was learning about this entire process of how scribes, especially Anglo-Saxon and Irish scribes, were actually
mhm,
responsible for much of the modern conventions we have about text. So I don't know how
mhm,
many of in the audience know this, but um, prior to these innovations, um, books, at least in the West, were written in what's called continuous scriptio, meaning continuous script. So basically, there were no breaks between words, and all the letters run into each other. And part of reading was your ability to break into words and to sort of parse the sentences out of this block of letters, essentially. The innovation of the insular manuscript tradition was to figure out that you can put spaces between the words and to have all kinds of little marks to help the reader read. So, for example, right, because in the Middle Ages, most readers were no longer speaking Latin or Greek as their classical Greek, as their actual languages. They spoke the vernacular, and they had to sort of learn to read these languages in adulthood, which meant that, Latin and Greek being strongly inflected languages often did not have the same kind of grammar as the vernaculars, which often relied on word order. So the scribes would put in these little marks in the manuscript called paving stone marks to help the reader discern what to read, or how to read. So here's the subject, here's the object, here's the verb, 1, 2, 3, or A, B, C, D, E, and you have to sort of jump around to follow that. So as I was researching this, I said, okay, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could get AI to go out there and find me some examples of these manuscripts so that I can see them for myself and sort of learn to read them myself. And, this was actually not easy because I tried to do it myself, and it's actually surprisingly hard to find good examples of this sort of thing. You would have to be a real specialist to know where to look. So I send, one of these AI chatbots out there, and actually I had to, so this is the thing. In order to prevent hallucinations, you really have to be actually on one of the more higher tier models and have them really do work. So the model went out there for half an hour and came back with some good examples, and I was following through them. And I was just wondering, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could talk to my AI and say, okay, this is great. Now I want you to generate for me some manuscript examples and have me try to do the paving stone annotations myself so I can really learn and understand how this works. Like, I could think of interactive exercises that would be generated on the fly, just geared for my own interest. I mean, this is a fairly esoteric topic. It's not like this is the sort of thing that you can hire a staff to go on there and do this. But if we had generative AI, true sovereign AI that is geared towards our individual interests, we can each of us craft these incredibly intricate, personalized lessons that will allow us to explore our interests to really, really, really depth that are just not possible right now. This will be like the internet, cubed, squared, or whatever. The internet allowed all of us to have access to more information than any other generation before. Just imagine doing research without the internet. I think if we do it right, it will be impossible to imagine learning and playing and sort of instructing yourself in the absence of AI. To have AI be able to sort of really help you learn a subject in depth in that way, I think would be incredibly fascinating and just beautiful.
I am struck by that so much. And you're making me think, I'm sort of thinking again of a hypothetical. So thinking of the role of the expert, right, and the role of the training. So I wonder if then, rather than maybe the kind of reframing of the internet as sort of just some vast nebulous network is a proliferation of highly specialized, highly individualized networks. So for instance, say you wanted to do this research with these manuscripts, these old manuscripts, you reach out to the AI of an expert in the field who had their own very locally created kind of model based on their decades of human experience, human research, human, and then that kind of exchange is possible. So, no, it's just so fascinating.
Phoenix, you know what you've done? You have just crystallized Vannevar Bush's dream of the Memex, right? The Memex was exactly this idea of each individual making links between all the
Mm-hmm.
knowledge that they gather,
Mm-hmm.
which is a
Mm-hmm.
model. It's a model.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Bush envisioned a future in which individuals would share these models as first class
Right.
artifacts with each other. This is what you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about. You're talking about
Mm-hmm.
each expert, each human expert
Mm-hmm.
crafting
Mm-hmm.
their own model, which is, in the
Mm-hmm.
language of the novel that I wrote, an
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
eaglet of their
Right. Yes.
expertise,
The ego.
which then can
Yes.
be
Exactly.
licensed out for
Exactly.
other people to
Yeah.
learn, to study from. That's the future
Yeah.
I want, the future in
Yeah.
which each individual, each
Mm-hmm.
sovereign individual
Mm-hmm.
being able to craft and articulate and
Mm-hmm.
train their own egolet to
Mm-hmm.
embody their expertise and then being able
Yeah.
to share these
Right.
around. This is what Vannevar Bush was imagining. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that we
Mm-hmm.
would also have our own memexes that we can then
Mm-hmm.
exchange. I mean, that is
Mm-hmm.
the future I want. That's
Yeah.
this is the real dream.
Yeah. Amazing. And it's and to bring it back to your work, and this is the kinds of really like just really, really revelatory kind of thought experiments that you can do with a book like this, or by even just chatting with you today and hearing you speak. It's yeah, it's fascinating. I could ask you so many more questions, but I am aware
I
of
love
time, and I
this.
do want to
Yeah.
make sure that our audience have already had put some great questions in the chat. So I will reluctantly turn to them because, as I said, a lot, but not reluctantly, but you know what I mean. Let's see what folks are asking. So Jean Paul asks, do you have a definition of consciousness that resonates with you?
Wow, what an amazing
Big,
question.
just just a little one, just a little,
Oh my God, what an amazing
just,
question. So I don't know. I've been reading about this and it's so fascinating, right? If you read older sci-fi, right, I think everybody just sort of assumed that intelligence and consciousness are sort of intertwining a way that's very hard to disentangle. And so in fact, if you read older works on sci-fi, almost always artificial intelligences are intelligent to the same degree that they become conscious. Like if you make them intelligent, sufficiently intelligent, they will become conscious. Like that's just how it is. Um, what we're seeing now is that's not how that works, right? We
hmm
now have we now sort of realize that we can't really tell when something is conscious, or we don't have a good definition for it. I mean, we
hmm
have these models that are capable of passing the GREs and scoring perfect, and,
Oh,
and being able to come up with new mathematical proofs and all kinds of stuff. Um, it's hard for me to say that's not intelligent, right? I mean, the
hmm
standard critique of this is nothing more than statistical correlation, this is a stochastic parrot, blah, blah, blah. Sure, okay. But again, it's very hard for me to say that if a thing is capable of doing all these things, including
hmm
things that humans cannot do yet,
hmm
um, that you can somehow say that this is not intelligent. What makes
hmm
more sense for me to say is it seems that intelligence by itself is not strictly correlated or
hmm
attached to consciousness. I can say to some degree that these
Right.
models are not conscious with high level of confidence, and yet they may be showing signs of intelligence. So it seems to me
hmm
that we now have to sort of disentangle these two. And then if
Yeah.
you go into the definition of consciousness, it seems like, in a lot of traditions, consciousness is not necessarily this highly analytical faculty. It's more like a
hmm
kind of almost not thinking awareness, right? So when you're
hmm
meditating,
hmm
you learn to have this no mind as the
hmm
ultimate
hmm
goal of consciousness, the kind of consciousness which is simply aware of the universe and yet is not engaged in analytical thinking. So in some
hmm
ways, we could say that, we've always had a tradition of human thinking that
hmm
separates consciousness from intelligence. It's just that they were not necessarily represented in classical
hmm
science fiction. So I find all of these issues deeply fascinating. And then I talk to
hmm
scientists who are studying this issue, and there's a huge amount of disagreement over what consciousness is, whether it's fundamental, whether it's something that's more like a higher level property. Maybe it's even an illusion. Maybe it's something that we can actually that requires some sort of quantum phenomenon to explain, or maybe it doesn't. It's entirely explainable
Mm.
by classical physics. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the right answer is, but it is really absolutely fascinating to talk to scientists who are studying this question and to sort of see what kind of answers they're coming up with and how they're exploring it.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that this is this is this is this is a question that's becoming more and more relevant with each passing day,
Mm-hmm.
mainly because of two trends. One is the trend of building these larger and larger models. Now, in Silicon Valley, there's a belief, sometimes explicitly stated, sometimes not, to your original question of what is this
Mm-hmm.
all for? Why are we building these
Mm-hmm.
models?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the answer, I think, for a lot of them is we're trying to build artificial general intelligence. We're trying to build something that is smarter than human
Mm-hmm.
intelligence that will somehow
Mm-hmm.
solve all of our problems. This is the idea that we're going
Mm-hmm.
to build a digital god that will come and save us.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
like all, religious faith, whether it's
Yeah.
capitalism, communism, or this kind of digital faith. I consider them religious faith. I consider them to be
Mm-hmm.
not
Yeah.
particularly subject to proof either way. They're going to keep on doing this until something happens.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me is. It seems to me that in the process of building artificial general intelligence or whatever they want to call it, plenty of people think that the current approach is a dead end. We'll never get there. And other people
Mm-hmm.
think that we just need to keep on going a little bit longer. But it
Mm-hmm.
seems like we have to answer the question of at what point have we actually achieved consciousness? Because part of what we're
Yeah.
doing here is at some point we're no longer going to be able to just politely say that these models are not conscious. At some point,
Mm-hmm.
as we are going to build something that will have its own will and agency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't we try to figure out what that moment is so we can recognize it?
Mm-hmm.
Surely we do not believe that, enslaving another consciousness is
Mm-hmm.
proper or excusable. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we should try to figure out what the
Mm-hmm.
definition of that is. So that's one part of it. The other
Mm-hmm.
part is there's a huge movement in terms of preserving human consciousness beyond the moment of death. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
effort put into this idea of we should be able to read and persist and replicate the structures of cognition and human consciousness
Mm.
in some manner. Well, again, we need to have a way of measuring when we have succeeded. How will
Mm-hmm.
we know when we have actually done that? We need to
Mm-hmm.
understand consciousness and have a better understanding of what it actually is, for
Mm-hmm.
all of these reasons.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I have two quick responses to that. Thank you for that wonderful question, Jean-Paul. I'm Greek, so I've been saying I'm Greek a lot on this Zoom today, so apologies everyone. But that latter question, that question of immortality, I feel is almost like tale as old as time, right? It's one of the most fundamental human questions.
Yes.
But I'm curious about. It made me think as you were talking about the drive towards AGI, right? A digital god that will save us, and it's fascinating to me. That the kind of push for all this in the last 5-10 years has sort of mirrored the decline of the space age, right? The defunding of
Yes. Yes.
space, outer space used to be the frontier, the techno utopian
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
frontier. We're going to spread humanity to the stars. This classic science fiction trope. We're going to solve our resource problem by mining the moon or mining Mars or any of these other things. And it's just again, this is not really a fully formed question, more of a thought alongside, but that kind of faith-based almost search for some kind of salvation that we can't even fully define, but that we're racing toward with a hope that AI now is the thing. And one of my favorite science fiction authors, Doris Lessing, she
Yeah.
coined the term inner space. And she coined this back
Yes.
in the 60s. And I love that so much because I think what you're talking about is really speaking to that kind of, on the one hand, very old human metaphysical, right, work, that drive, but it's kind of turning inwards now instead of outer, to the stars, to
Yeah.
space.
And I wonder to what extent it really is just a manifestation of the fact that there's a deep impulse towards religiosity within the human mind, and that we have to
Yeah.
sort of turn that religious energy somewhere. So,
Hmm.
my belief is that a great deal of 20th century ideology, a great deal
Mm.
of, the rise of, Freudianism, Marxism, and all kinds of these um, superficially rationalistic philosophies that have a deep
Mm.
religious flavor to them. I think that's just sort of now being manifested in this kind of new digital AGI based kind of yearning,
Mm.
the
Hmm.
yearning for the
Hmm.
singularity, the yearning for this moment when the machine will exceed us and then just
Yeah.
save us. There
Yeah.
is something very religious about this, and I think it's just that deep religious
Mm.
fervor
Yeah.
coming through. I
Yeah.
don't think it's either bad or good. It's just something that we have to recognize. I
Hmm.
think there's a great deal of
Hmm.
irrationality and religiosity in the way
Hmm.
we think about the
Yeah.
future. That has
Yeah.
never been fully removed, or maybe it shouldn't be. Who knows? But
Hmm.
that's a
Hmm.
big part of our speculative heritage.
Hmm. Yeah. No, definitely. I love how you put that. The machine. We're yearning for a machine that will exceed us and then save us, right? There's kind of multiple
Hmm.
assumptions happening there. Another question from Claire in the audience says, "Hello, Ken. I'm curious whether your writing drives your research or vice versa, and what you think
Oh
about the
wow.
possibilities of approaching a single question, be it through working in industry, journalism, research, writing, and why you've chosen writing fiction specifically to explore these big questions about technology and humanity." So
Yeah.
two-parter there. So yeah, writing, driving
Great.
research. Yeah.
Absolutely, great question. And like all great questions, I don't think my answers will be as good as the questions. Um, so on the first part, I think it's both. I mean, when I'm trying to write a novel, I will often ask myself interesting questions that I need to then research and figure out. But the research oftentimes will drive me down certain alleyways that will then inspire new stories. Like, I was telling you earlier, this entire manuscript tradition interest was very much driven by my interest in the whole idea of what does art look like in the age of AI. And I wanted to research examples historically of how human craft has been gradually displaced by mechanistic means and what
Hmm.
that has meant. What did humans do? Like, what did scribes who are meaning makers in their book copying operation, what happened to them after the printing press came along? I wanted to know what happened to painters who believed that their job was to copy nature. What happened to them after photography came along? And now,
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
happened to, just the very idea that art has been this relentless process of mimesis being displaced gradually by machines that can copy. I found that really intriguing and interesting. And so I was researching that as a way of thinking through these questions. And that ended up driving the kind of novel I wanted to write, because in a lot of ways, all that we see or seem engages with the same kind of questions. Um, excuse me. And similarly, now to the other part of the question of, you know, um, sorry, how did Claire phrase it? Um,
Uh,
the Do you mind rereading that last
no, of
part?
course not. No. What you think about the possibilities of approaching a single question, be it through working in industry, journalism, research, writing, and why you've chosen writing fiction to explore these big
Yeah.
questions.
So as far as this last part, it has to do with me and my uneasy relationship with storytelling, right? So I had a deep interest in history and historiography. And what happened to me was I lost faith in um, basically non-fictional methods of telling stories.
Mm,
It seemed
mm,
very hard for me to figure out how we can tell a story without, in the very process of making a story, distort the underlying truth that I was trying to understand or convey. So if you study
mhm,
history, which I sort of did, if in an amateur fashion, as a result of working as a litigation consultant and then therefore studying the history of technology, it turns out that, the facts are the facts, but there are countless stories that are possible that you can tell given the same set of facts by leaving some facts out, by highlighting other facts. Something as simple as why did we abandon electric cars and go to the internal combustion engine? You can actually tell a
Mm.
bazillion different stories about why that happened. And
Mm-hmm.
each of them teaches a slightly different lesson. And to me, that was very difficult, sort of to not acknowledge that. And it turns out, in my opinion, a great deal of the nonfiction narratives that we have flying around are either exaggerations or distortions of underlying facts. And you can sort of tell a slightly different story that would, undermine a lot of the conclusions. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of the
Mm-hmm.
very popular nonfiction books fall into that trap. I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
remember something like The Blind Side, right? It was a particular story
Oh
about a
yeah.
particular person.
Mm-hmm.
And then we
Mm-hmm.
later on learned that that story was actually not true because the
Mm-hmm.
facts were interpreted a certain way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so for me, my uneasy relationship with nonfiction storytelling
Mm.
pushed me towards fiction because at least in fiction, we are very explicit about the fact that we're making this up. We are
Right.
crafting stories. We're crafting stories to understand the universe in a particular way. Whereas in
Mm-hmm.
nonfiction, I think sometimes it is possible for you to be so enamored of the story you're trying to tell that you forget that
Mm-hmm.
you're actually telling the story and you believe that the story equals the truth,
The truth, yeah.
whatever that means, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when you're trying to tell fiction, I mean, Le Guin says something like this: we fiction writers are not interested in the facts. We are interested in the truth with a capital T. We're
Mm-hmm.
trying explicitly to lie in order to get at the truth somehow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to me, the paradox there of knowing explicitly that we're making up stuff, but we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to go as close as we can to the truth. To me, that felt like a more tenable position, something that I can
Mm-hmm.
deal with more easily. I can't be a historian or a journalist because I will be just caught up all the time in to what extent am I properly letting the story not overwhelm the facts? To what extent am I shaping the facts too much? I think I would just be paralyzed by
Mm-hmm.
constantly having to make those decisions. But in fiction, I
Mm-hmm.
don't. In fiction, I'm explicitly
Yeah.
making it up.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. You remind me of the quote from Pablo Picasso's "Art is a lie that tells the truth," and I
Yes,
think
exactly.
that speaks to that kind of exactly that paradox you're describing. We are at time. I do want to respect your time, David. I'm so sorry we didn't get to your question in the chat, but Ken, thank you so much for
Thank you so
spending
much.
this hour with us. Again, went by in a flash. This was so generative. Tell us where we can find you. Obviously, you have all that we see or seem out. You got
Yes.
anything else you want to plug?
Yes, you should come if you want to follow my work, you can go to my website kenliu.com or kenliu.name and just sign up for my newsletter. There's a link for it. It's a Substack, but you should come to my website and use the link because um, I don't want to be tied to a platform like Substack. Who knows what these platforms are going to do. So I'm always a little paranoid. I always want people to come to my site directly and then, just sign up so that at least I get your email and I get to track it myself as opposed to relying on some other provider. But you can sign up for my newsletter and follow my publication news. I'm super excited about this new series of Julia Z novels, and also later on this year, I will be publishing my third collection of short fiction called "The
Oh,
Passing of the
fantastic.
Dragon and Other Stories." I'm really excited about it because this is a collection that's more focused on the idea of what does it mean to be an artist? What is the point of
Hmm.
art? Some of the things that we're talking about here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, that just about wraps up the symposium. So thank you again, Ken, for joining us. Everyone, thank you so much for being with us today and for your wonderful questions. And yeah, I think I'll end it here. And I just want to wish everyone a prosperous, healthy, happy as much as possible
Absolutely.
2026.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, Phoenix. It's amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ken. Cheers.